Chapter 2. Among the nobles who gathered in the main palace that day was Duke Alpheus, a man of great ambition and pride. His striking white hair and piercing golden eyes made him an imposing figure, and he carried himself with the kind of confidence that came only from years of power and prestige. His tailored suit, gray and rich in color, gleamed with the wealth and influence he wielded, in stark contrast to the emperor's simple yet commanding appearance. The main palace, towering above the garnet and ruby palaces, was a grand testament to the royal family's power. Its halls stretched endlessly, with high ceilings adorned with glittering chandeliers that could illuminate the darkest of days. The marble floors shone with a polish so immaculate it seemed as though the stones themselves were bathed in light. Walls decorated with gold-trimmed banners and portraits of past rulers filled the space, depicting triumphs and victories that spoke of the empire's long-standing dominance. The nobles were gathered in the palace's grand audience chamber, where the emperor would address them. Today, the emperor arrived in his usual attire, a simple, white Roman-style robe that clung to his tall form. His bare chest, stark and exposed beneath the fabric, stood in sharp contrast to the opulence around him, emphasizing the emperor's quiet humility. Despite his appearance, there was an undeniable presence about him, a cold, almost intimidating aura that commanded attention the moment he stepped into the room. Duke Alpheus, standing tall among the nobles, cast a scrutinizing glance at the emperor as he entered. He couldn't help but notice the difference between the emperor's modest attire and the extravagance of the noble class surrounding him. It was no secret that the emperor's robes were far humbler than any noble's finely tailored suit or the dazzling dresses of the ladies. Alpheus found it both curious and vexing, especially in the wake of the rumor circulating about the emperor's newfound affection for the princess. "Quite the entrance, Your Majesty," Duke Alpheus said, his voice smooth but laced with an underlying tone of challenge as he offered a respectful bow. The emperor's cold, calculating gaze swept across the room, locking onto Alpheus. "Duke Alpheus," he greeted him, his tone a perfect blend of indifference and authority. The duke straightened up, his gold eyes flickering with a hint of skepticism. "There have been rumors," he began, his voice intentionally nonchalant as he continued, "about the princess. I assume you're aware of them, Your Majesty." The emperor's expression remained unchanged. "I am," he said curtly, his gaze now sharpening. "And you find them troubling?" Alpheus pressed, his words hanging in the air with an unspoken challenge. The emperor's eyes flickered, a brief moment of something unreadable crossing his face. He didn't respond right away, but when he did, it was in his usual detached manner. "It is not for you to concern yourself with." Alpheus didn't back down, his ambition urging him forward. "But surely, Your Majesty, such rumors would affect the reputation of the royal family. The nobles are curious, and we must remain vigilant, for appearances matter." The emperor's expression hardened, but he remained calm. "Appearances?" he echoed, the single word dripping with quiet disdain. "I care little for the whispers of nobles or servants. My family's strength lies in power, not gossip." As he spoke, the nobles exchanged looks. They had all heard the stories, how the emperor had started spending more time with the princess in the private garnet and ruby palaces. But no one had seen the princess for themselves. No one had proof. Duke Alpheus, however, wasn't satisfied. His golden eyes gleamed with calculation as he pressed further. "And what of the princess?" "The empire would be eager to see her, Your Majesty. To know that she is as worthy as her father." The emperor's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. He simply turned away, his robe swishing behind him as he walked toward the grand throne. The room fell silent, every noble holding their breath in anticipation. "Be patient, Duke," the emperor said over his shoulder. "When the time comes, the princess will be revealed, as is proper." The nobles exchanged uneasy glances. They had all been hoping for a glimpse of the princess, perhaps to gauge her worth, or even to determine how much power she might hold in the future. But the emperor's cryptic answer left more questions than it did answers. As the meeting continued, Duke Alpheus couldn't shake the feeling that the emperor's actions were far more strategic than they appeared. His attention wasn't solely on his daughter, but on something much larger. And Alpheus knew that in this game of power, every move, every glance, and every word from the emperor carried weight. The rumors would continue to swirl, but Alpheus would not be satisfied until he saw the princess with his own eyes. He was determined to find out what truly lay beneath the surface of these royal intrigues. After the meeting ended in a cold, detached manner, Duke Alpheus returned to his grand estate. The sprawling grounds were meticulously kept, with tall iron gates at the entrance and marble pillars marking the edges of the garden. The main house was a stately stone building, its dark stone walls adorned with intricate carvings and high windows that let in the soft evening light. The air smelled faintly of fresh herbs from the garden and the scent of leather from the duke's study, where he often spent hours reading. As he entered, he was greeted by his son, Ezekiel, who ran up to him with a bright smile. "Father! You're home." Ezekiel's white hair, now a little longer and tousled, gleamed under the chandelier's light, his golden eyes shining with excitement. "You've been good today?" the duke asked, lifting his son onto his shoulders. "Yes, yes." Ezekiel nodded vigorously. "I studied and played with Jeanette." His small hands tugged at his father's sleeve. "Come, I want to show you something." The duke's gaze softened for a moment, but it quickly turned back to business. "Lead the way, Ezekiel." Ezekiel quickly dashed off, his excitement palpable, and the duke followed, his sharp gaze scanning the room as they moved. The little girl, Jeanette, was seated at a small table, playing with a toy, a soft, plush animal that looked like a small rabbit. Her brunette hair framed her innocent face, and her blue eyes sparkled with curiosity as she babbled in her soft, childlike tone. "Wah!" she exclaimed, waving her tiny arms as she spotted the duke. "Wah-pay!" The duke raised a brow, but bent down to gently pat her head. "Not today, little one. But we'll play soon enough." He could already see how easily she won over people with her innocence, her pure sweetness masking the greater, darker purpose he had in mind for her. Jeanette giggled and returned to her toy, her attention already back on the game. Ezekiel, ever the observant child, noticed his father's distant gaze. "Father, do you think Jeanette will be able to meet the emperor one day?" The duke smirked, knowing exactly what his son meant. "One day, Ezekiel. She will. And when she does, she'll make sure the emperor knows exactly who she is." He paused, watching Jeanette as she looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. She has the same eyes as the royal family, after all. Ezekiel's gaze shifted to Jeanette thoughtfully. "She'll win him over, won't she?" The duke nodded slowly, a cold gleam in his golden eyes. "She will. And when she does, we'll be in the right place at the right time." Jeanette, oblivious to the scheming unfolding around her, continued to babble in her innocent way, her gaze fixated on the toy in front of her. She was sweet, so sweet, exactly what they needed. 5 years old. Years passed, and Athanasia was now 5 years old. Her once timid nature had evolved into a child brimming with curiosity and quiet intelligence. Claude, as he watched her grow, couldn't help but notice how much she had changed. While her manners still had much room for improvement, there was no denying that she had come a long way. She was more composed, more eloquent in speech, and more confident in her little world. One afternoon, Claude happened upon Athanasia reading a book in the corner of the Garnet Palace's library, her tiny fingers turning the pages with determination. Despite her young age, she had taught herself to read and write, a skill far ahead of her years. "You've been reading again, haven't you?" Claude asked, his voice gentle, yet filled with a hint of surprise. Athanasia looked up from her book, her crystal blue eyes bright. "Yes, Papa. It's about the old kings." Claude raised an eyebrow. The old kings, he thought, impressed. It was clear to him that Athanasia wasn't content to simply play like most children her age. Her love for books was evident, and she had already far surpassed what most noble children could do at her age. She had picked up reading and writing without much formal guidance, leaving Claude quietly astounded. It's time she gets proper lessons, Claude decided. He couldn't have her wasting time while she was so capable. The typical noble child would begin their education at 8, but Athanasia was already reading and writing at 5. She needed more. The next day, the Ruby Palace was filled with a new sense of purpose as the tutors arrived. The first was Countess Eloise, a woman with an air of elegance and strict discipline. She was to be Athanasia's etiquette tutor, teaching her proper manners and how to carry herself among nobility. "Hello, Princess. I'm Countess Eloise. I'll be your etiquette teacher," she greeted with a polite bow. Claude, as always, observed from the sidelines, though his usual cold demeanor softened slightly as he watched his daughter greet the Countess with a curtsy. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Countess Eloise," Athanasia said, her voice calm and refined for someone her age. The tutors were stunned. They had expected a child prone to tantrums and mischief, but Athanasia was nothing like that. She was well-behaved, poised, and more mature than any 5-year-old should be. Even Countess Eloise was taken aback by how easily the princess adapted to the lessons. Claude couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet pride. Athanasia's composure was remarkable, especially for someone so young. Along with Countess Eloise, Claude had also arranged for a history and math tutor. He was pleased to see that Athanasia had already demonstrated an aptitude for both subjects. The teachers were equally surprised to learn that the princess could already read and write, far beyond the basics. Felix and Lillian, both of whom had grown quite fond of Athanasia over the years, watched the lessons unfold with a sense of pride. Felix, who had been there for her since the early days, couldn't hide his smile when Athanasia answered a question correctly. "She's growing up fast," Felix murmured to Lillian, who nodded in agreement. "I'm so proud," Lillian replied, her voice filled with affection. Meanwhile, the servants in the palace began to gossip about the princess's remarkable progress. Whispers of her intelligence and manners spread throughout the Ruby Palace and beyond, reaching even the main palace where nobles gathered. Some were impressed, while others, especially the more cynical nobles, remained skeptical of the rumors surrounding her. "They say the emperor has taken quite a liking to his daughter," one of the servants commented. "I heard she's already reading books on ancient kings," another servant replied, her voice tinged with awe. "5 years old, and already better than most of us," a third servant mused, shaking their head in disbelief. The chatter was relentless, but one thing was clear: the image of the princess was shifting. No longer seen merely as an innocent child, Athanasia was becoming a figure to be reckoned with, her potential already evident in the quiet, diligent way she pursued knowledge. Claude, watching it all unfold, remained as stoic as ever. He wasn't one for praise, but as he observed his daughter from a distance, he couldn't deny that he was quietly impressed. Duke Alpheus wasn't pleased by the growing rumors surrounding the princess. As whispers about her intelligence spread like wildfire, he couldn't afford to let them go unchecked. Such things didn't sit well with him, especially given how pivotal the princess's future could be to his own plans. He needed confirmation. Determined to see for himself, Duke Alpheus requested a private audience with the emperor. The request was granted, and as he made his way to the Garnet Palace, he hoped to gain insight into the mysterious girl who had captivated the palace with her sudden rise in stature. As he approached the grand entrance of the Garnet Palace, he almost collided with Felix, who was coming out of the palace holding the princess in his arms. Felix was a steady, composed figure, but even he couldn't hide the warmth he felt for the princess as he carefully adjusted her to his arms. Athanasia looked utterly charming, dressed in a delicate pink dress that seemed to shimmer with every movement. The fabric was soft and flowing, dotted with intricate lace trim around the hem and sleeves. Her dress was accented by a matching satin ribbon at her waist, tied into a neat bow, giving her an ethereal look that was only accentuated by the soft golden light of the Garnet Palace. Her platinum blonde hair cascaded in soft waves, carefully arranged into a ponytail that swished lightly with each step Felix took. A few stray curls framed her face, and her crystal blue eyes, striking, sharp, and undeniably royal, gleamed with a quiet curiosity as she looked at the Duke. Felix nodded respectfully as he saw the Duke, but Athanasia, ever polite despite her youth, immediately greeted him in the most gracious way she knew. "Good afternoon, sir," she said with a little curtsy, her voice soft and sweet, though it carried the elegance of someone much older. Her eyes never left the Duke's face, studying him with the innocent curiosity only a child of her age could have. Duke Alpheus, taken aback by the princess's composure, barely kept his cool, though he couldn't help but admire her poise. He had expected her to be just another innocent child, unaware of the implications of her intelligence. But now, standing before her, he saw something more, an air of authority that should not have been present in a child so young. He offered a cold, polite smile in return, though his golden eyes narrowed slightly as he assessed her. "Princess," he said, his voice smooth but with a hint of calculated charm. "It's a pleasure to finally make your acquaintance." Felix shifted uncomfortably, sensing the underlying tension in the air, but he didn't dare interrupt. Athanasia, however, smiled warmly at the Duke, her blue eyes bright with innocent curiosity, her mannerisms still far more refined than any child her age. "It's nice to meet you, sir," she repeated, her voice soft but confident. The little princess continued to gaze at him, as if trying to figure him out. Duke Alpheus's thoughts were interrupted as Felix moved past him, heading toward the palace. The princess, carried gently in his arms, was ready for her tea time with her father. But even as she was whisked away, the Duke couldn't shake the image of her, so small, yet so poised, and carrying herself in a way that was unsettling. As the Duke made his way deeper into the Garnet Palace, he felt a heavy weight settle on his chest. He wasn't just dealing with any ordinary princess. This one was different. He had seen that for himself now. He couldn't afford to let her slip from his grasp. The rumors were true. And that was both a blessing and a curse for him. The Duke returned to his estate with a single focus, Jeanette. After the unnerving encounter with the princess, he couldn't afford to let his ward fall behind, especially now that the whispers about Athanasia's intelligence were growing louder. He couldn't let his golden goose, his best chance to climb the ladder of power, be overshadowed by her half-sister. No, he had to act fast and take decisive steps. Jeanette had been living a carefree life until now. The 5-year-old spent her days playing with her dolls, happily lost in her own world, unaware of the plans swirling around her. But all of that changed the moment the Duke returned home. That afternoon, as the warm sunlight streamed through the grand windows of the Duke's estate, Jeanette was summoned to the study. She entered with a smile, only to find an unfamiliar sternness in the air. The once lively atmosphere of her playtime had vanished, replaced by the heavy silence of expectation. "Uncle," Jeanette said, her sweet voice barely above a whisper, but the Duke only nodded curtly, motioning for her to sit down at the large sofa in front of him. She glanced around the room, puzzled, wondering why everything felt different today. "Sit," the Duke instructed, his tone cold and unyielding. The little girl, confused but obedient, sat down behind the desk, her brown locks falling around her face. Her simple blue dress was still neat from earlier, but it didn't have the same grandeur as the dresses worn by royal children. Jeanette's features were soft, her face innocent, with her brown hair framing her cherubic face. She had the same blue eyes as the royal family, but aside from that, she looked nothing like her true heritage. The Duke had made sure of that, her bloodline hidden under layers of secrecy, even her own understanding of who she was kept in the dark. Jeanette was still unaware that she was royal. She simply thought of herself as the Duke's ward, living in his grand estate, loved but not too far removed from the life of a noble. The Duke wasted no time. He motioned to the tutors standing at the side, preparing themselves. These were the same tutors who had taught Athanasia. He expected them to do the same for Jeanette, to shape her into the image of a poised and intelligent child, just like her half-sister. His expression was tight with resolve. Jeanette blinked, her brow furrowing slightly. She wasn't used to being in the study like this, with so much seriousness. "Uncle," she ventured again, but her question was met with silence. The tutors, who had been briefed on their new pupil, exchanged uncomfortable glances. They had heard about Jeanette's lack of intellectual gifts. They didn't know why the Duke had chosen to have them teach her in the same way they'd taught the princess, but it seemed pointless. The girl was slow to understand the basics. Unlike Athanasia, who had impressed them with her ability to read and write by the age of 5, Jeanette barely grasped the simplest of concepts. Let's begin, one tutor said, her voice soft, trying to be gentle with Jeanette as she pulled out a book from the stack. First, we'll start with your letters. Can you show me the letter A? Jeanette stared at the paper in confusion, her mind still clouded by the thought of her dolls. She had never had to study like this before. She didn't understand why it was necessary. She was just a little girl who wanted to play. The sudden pressure was overwhelming. When she didn't answer immediately, the tutor sighed, trying to remain patient, but Jeanette could sense the disappointment in the air. Meanwhile, the Duke watched from the side, his jaw clenched in frustration. He had hoped that Jeanette would have taken to the lessons more easily, but instead, she struggled, unable to even properly recognize her letters. Again, he muttered, his voice cold. Focus. Jeanette bit her lip, but obediently nodded, trying to follow the lesson, though she didn't quite understand. She didn't know why she was expected to be anything other than the playful child she had always been. The tutors whispered among themselves, clearly baffled by the Duke's insistence on pushing Jeanette so hard. To them, it was obvious that the girl wasn't cut out for such lessons. Her jeweled blue eyes, hidden with magic, now looked plain with no mark of her heritage. But even with that, she didn't seem to have the royal grace or intellect they'd seen in Athanasia. One tutor leaned toward another and whispered, "Do you think he plans to marry her off? Perhaps to the prince of a neighboring kingdom?" The other tutor only shrugged, unsure of the Duke's true intentions. "It's hard to say. But it's strange, isn't it? Why push her so hard when she doesn't even seem to understand?" Jeanette's only response to the lessons was a quiet whimper as she struggled to make sense of it all. She didn't know why things had changed so drastically. She didn't understand the weight of the Duke's expectations. The Duke stood by, watching her with a mixture of frustration and impatience, wondering if the lessons would ever take hold. He didn't care for the tutor's doubts, and he didn't care for Jeanette's tears. He had one goal in mind: Jeanette had to shine, and she had to outshine Athanasia, whether she was ready or not. Like, comment and subscribe to be notified for updates in the series.